Racial abuse in football, sport and mental health, celebrating the multi-skilled. Yes, the running order on this episode is as varied and dynamic as England's Rugby World Cup squad. Today, we're picking apart the persistent problems with rampant racism, we reflect on those who shared and cared on World Mental Health Day, and we look back on those who excelled in multiple sports, following in the footsteps of a certain Czech goalie. Welcome everyone to SportSpiel. Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to our October discussion episode. The leaves are falling, autumn is here, but there remains a final radiance of warmth in the form of the ever-enthusiastic Will Moulton.
That sounded sarcastic. I'm always enthusiastic.
Of course you are. Although, shock horror to the listeners, I've just discovered you don't drink coffee or tea.
Well, you know what I'm like on the podcast as it is. As you said, I am quite enthusiastic and quite opinionated. Imagine then putting caffeine into my system. How bad I would be.
How do you cope with like a 6 a.m. wake-up call?
You just get on with it, don't you, once you're awake?
Disagree. Anyway, it's been a few weeks since we last met up for one of these. Well, end of September, to be precise. How has life been in the last 2-3 weeks?
It's been good. In the hockey world, we are building up to our very important Olympic qualifiers. Important in so many ways because of not just a place at Tokyo, but potential funding and things like that. So it's quite a high-pressured office at the moment, quite a high-pressured environment to be in. And we, of course, experienced another high-pressured environment at the London Stadium, didn't we? Going to watch West Ham against Spurs. Some questionable finishing from the West Ham forwards. But fair play to Spurs, and it was great to see so many players in the London Stadium create quite a good noise as well.
Yep, I'd spent that entire day bigging up West Ham's forward line, particularly Martha Thomas, who missed a sitter. Right,
two sitters.
One particularly stands out in the mind, where blazoned it wide when she was 2 yards out.
She did go and score a nice goal the subsequent week against, was it Bristol?
Yes, which we weren't at.
No.
Rather annoyingly. But no, other than that, a good day out and a decent crowd as well. And considering, I think you said that because you were at the Stamford Bridge game for Chelsea and Tottenham, was it back at the start of September now? And even though it was like a similar number of people there, there's something about the roof in the Olympic Stadium that kind of keeps the noise in when they generate noise.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I think I was impressed because the West Ham Stadium is a capacity of 60,000, whereas Chelsea is only about 45 or 40. So there was a percentage-wise, was proportionally lower people compared to the number of seats at West Ham, but they generated such a greater noise. I wasn't sure if that's because we were all clumped together, whereas at Chelsea they're a bit more spread out, or because there was a partial roof on that they kept the noise in. But even watching back on the Women's Football Show highlights, you could hear the buzz throughout the game, which was fantastic. And again, whether you agree or disagree with having women's football in bigger stadiums, not the men's stadiums, but to try and boost the game, but it's so far this season in the top tier, it's done quite well. Maybe less so. I think Charlton have tried to play a couple of games at the Valley and it hasn't been particularly well attended. But for teams like Manchester City and Chelsea and West Ham, and now Reading as well, hosting I think 4 games in 4 weeks at the Madejski in various competitions, it's showing that the capacity for women's football and the support is there. And then obviously, I think we're going to the Lionesses game, aren't we? Which is going to be a sellout. I was about
to mention that because they announced the friendly England versus Germany at Wembley has sold out. We've got 2 of those tickets. Happy days, so we'll be there. But it does show the appetite is there to go along to women's football. I'm listening to some of the podcasts and reading some of the news around it. I look back at the Chelsea-Arsenal game, which was last week, which was held at Kingsmeadow, one of the smaller grounds and where Chelsea women will call their home now, and over 4,000 people turned up to that game. which for a ground like that is a phenomenal number. And I remember people who'd gone to that game, the general reaction was how great the atmosphere was because there were so many people there. And Arsenal had also bought all their tickets in the same section. So they just essentially created a segregated section of Arsenal fans, which really helped build that atmosphere in that ground. So far, I think after the World Cup, a lot of us were asking about the attendances and what they would be like. Positive signs thus far, which is great news all around.
But does the women's game need segregated sections? This is something we'll probably discuss in our first topic, but I think it was great. So both the women's games I've been to have had Spurs fans, and there's been a clump of Spurs fans, chanting and singing, but also at the same time when we were at West Ham, you were a West Ham fan, we had West Ham fans to our right and Spurs fans to our left. And we were all integrated and it was fine, and there was no threat or anything like that. So I get having sort of maybe pockets of like the hardcore fans for the chanting, but at the same time I don't know how much segregation you actually need in the women's game to create a good atmosphere.
A topic to touch on later on, perhaps. Yeah, with that introduction, I suppose we'll actually crack on with the topics that I mentioned right at the start in this intro. The first topic on racism and football fandom comes after this. England's 6-0 win over Bulgaria in the Euro 2020 qualifiers should have been about the goals and the football, but it wasn't. Instead, the match was stopped twice following racist chanting by home supporters in Sofia. 4 people were arrested and fined 1,000 Bulgarian lev, that's around £443, and they were banned from sporting events for 2 years. Bulgaria's head coach Krasimir Balakov resigned 4 days after the game, where he said he hadn't heard anything post-match. As damning and depressing as those scenes were, and there was no shortage of coverage in the media of it either, things are hardly rosy on these shores either. Just yesterday, that's Saturday, October the 19th as we record, the FA Cup tie between Haringey Borough and Yeovil Town was abandoned amid accusations of racist abuse. Haringey goalkeeper Valerie Douglas-Pagetat was reportedly spat at and hit by an object thrown from the Yeovil end, and defender Kobe Rowe was also reportedly racially abused as the match was abandoned, with Haringey walking off. It's 2019, in case we hadn't all noticed. Yet, this season, we are seeing incident after incident virtually every week. I think of what happened this weekend, what happened in Bulgaria, what has happened to Lukaku out in Italy, and there's been other incidents here on our shores as well. Can we get to grips on what the problem is with this persistent racist abuse that we are seeing time after time, specifically here?
The thing that strikes me is that why is this only a major issue in football? And one of the most, it's not just prevalent in the stadiums, it's also very prevalent on social media, and players like Tammy Abraham when he missed a penalty in the Super Cup against Liverpool, and other players getting racially abused on social media when they make mistakes. But if, for example, Anthony Watson yesterday in the rugby for England, if he hadn't scored that try in the last few minutes, if he dropped the ball or if he'd been red carded, would he have been subjected to racial abuse on social media? Possibly, but nowhere near as much as the footballers would have been. And it seems to be that other sports do have their issues with race and racism, but they seem to be 1 or 2 a year, maybe slightly more frequently, whereas football, as you say, there's something every week, potentially every weekend, 2 or 3 times a week and happening, and it's hard to really explain why, when football is the game that is globally understood by everyone. It's the one game that everyone plays and understands, really.
Like I said, you can recall numerous incidents off of the top of your head from this year, including one in the women's game where Renee Hector, who was playing for Tottenham at the time, that's back in January now, 2019, but it wasn't actually dealt with until I think about May time, was racially abused by an opponent, not even from the crowd.
An opponent who still denies it.
Who still denies it, was found guilty by the FA, and has subsequently had a contract cancelled with Sheffield United. But then, even this year, we look back at the Raheem Sterling incident. That was at Chelsea, at Stamford Bridge. And the Lukaku one. Again, that's Italy. But I think the Lukaku one in particular strikes up the first main talking point about football fandom that we were discussing before we started recording, and that's the tribalism aspect. Because the baffling thing about the Lukaku one was that the Inter-Ultras, so his own fans, then put out that ridiculous statement a few days afterwards where they said it's not racism, it's just football fans doing what they can to put off their opponents and doing anything at all costs for the win. And that to me sums up the tribalism that is prevalent in football fandom that we perhaps don't see in other sports.
I think in countries like Italy, Bulgaria, Serbia, they are countries that are still have an issue with racism, and they're predominantly white, and they do have an issue with anyone who isn't. Whereas over in this country, we used to be a lot more like that, but I think as a society we're so much more tolerant now, and because we've had people coming to our shores from all corners of the world, and they've been welcomed in and accepted, and it's become normal now to have such a multi-ethnic society, which is fantastic. So it's sort of easier to explain in those foreign countries, where it's actually more difficult to explain over here why we feel the need to target players based on their skin. And because of the way it is in football, it must be something to do with the culture and the tribalism that we associate with football. And I asked the question to you before, is sort of not just the issue with racism, but the more so now because of the way we're talking about it, but also the issue with football culture and football fan culture. Is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? We in the media and we in society build up football fans as having to fit this stereotype, and the way that games are policed and things like that, it's almost expected that fans are going to kick off and be badly behaved. And now it's almost, with the way things are at the moment, it's expected fans are going to be racist. So is it almost a case of we are creating these environments where they feel like they have to act in those ways? And I'm not suggesting that is the case. It's just a question of, is that part of the problem? We actually assume that it's going to happen, and the fans almost feel like obliged to make it happen because that's what's expected of them.
I think partially obliged, but also because the attitude of abuse in football stadiums has become so normalised. It doesn't necessarily have to be racial abuse. You hear it from the stands every minute. It's just people seem to have categories of acceptable levels of abuse. You know, it's all right to hurl a ton of swear words at the referee or a player who's not playing well, which seems to be fine. Yet in the street you wouldn't dare talk to anyone like that. But for some reason in a football stadium it seems to be alright, and has been alright for several years, and people seem to use that as like fuel to the fire. And then you throw the racism side of things, and that seems to give people the excuse, I don't want to say excuse, but sort of a reason for them to let loose and then go down this racial side of things. But touching on something you said in the lead up to that, which I'm skipping a couple of pages forward because I had this written down before, and you said about society in Eastern European countries compared to here being totally different, and that they still have a problem with racism. I don't think we're totally in the clear society-wise here either. I know people like to see this multicultural thing, and people like you and me don't have a problem with it, but I still think there's a deep-rooted issue there. And I picked that up because Emerson Boyce, formerly of Wigan, 2013 FA Cup winning captain of Wigan, he did an interview in the Mirror yesterday where he said he felt world leaders such as Boris Johnson and Donald Trump were hindering the fight against racism. His quote in that interview, he said, "Politicians and other people in positions of power must realise that when they make offensive and insulting comments on race and colour, they are giving ordinary people licence to do exactly the same." E.g. the Donald Trump send her back chant that we remember from a few months ago. God, that's awful to hear. And that was about a US congresswoman who arrived as a child refugee 30 years ago now. But then even I look at my own role as a reporter and I scroll through comments on Facebook when we put up certain stories and say there's a black person who's been convicted of a crime, and all the comments will be, obviously they're black. Exactly. That sort of tone. So you can still see it in society somewhere. And to me, it's society still has an undercurrent of problems there. But for some reason, these people, when they get into a football stadium, that seems to be an arena where they feel a bit like social media, a little bit of anonymity to it, where they can just let loose and say what they want without any ramifications.
But is it what they actually think, or is it what they feel that they should say? My example here being, so if we remember back 2 or 3 years to the incident with the Chelsea fans on the metro, pushing the black
That's
passenger.
in Paris, wasn't it?
It was indeed, pushing the black passenger off the train and shouting, we're racist, that's the way we like it. So 5 people were convicted for that. 4 were given custodial sentences in this country, and 1 wasn't, but he was given a 3-year ban from attending all football matches. And I went to school with that person. He was in the same year as me. I interacted with him quite a lot. And while the bloke is an idiot and not a particularly likeable person, I would never have put him down as a racist, because he never had, well, he had issues with everyone, but I had never once heard him pick on someone because of their race or anything like that. To be honest, he picked on me more than anyone else, just because I was short and injured all the time. And I wouldn't put him down as being a racist, but on that particular occasion, he showed what he acted in a racist way by singing that, by chanting that. Although he denies it, claiming he was, the only reason his mouth was open in the video is because he was breathing, was his genuine defence in court. But my argument is that is it a case that these people are potentially not feeling like they've got the anonymity to say what they really feel, but is it the opposite? They're in a situation where they feel it's almost expected of them to say that, because that's what everyone else does with speech marks.
Or is it like that, but the flip side, in that he always had those thoughts, but now that he's got people to back him in a football fan environment, he feels comfortable enough to say them, whereas perhaps in school he might not have. Hypothetically.
Yeah, hypothetically.
Matthew Syed wrote about it this week as well in the Times. He said, the more the topic of racism is channeled through the prism of football, the less we talk about the racism that afflicts the millions of people who don't play in the Premier League or don't represent the England football team. He then went on to say, I remember chatting to Gareth Southgate about racism in football. He mentioned a press conference where journalists were haranguing him about how little the footballing authorities did to stamp out racism. Southgate paused and asked the assorted writers to look around them, and when they glanced to either side and around the room, they were met by a sea of white faces. That kind of takes us on to the other point of inclusion in football. And we have touched on it, I think, in previous episodes and things like that, where we've talked particularly about the price of going to a football match and how expensive it is. And frustratingly, the way of the world at the moment, say we're in London, take that as a tiny case study. By and large, if you're from a poorer background and you can't afford to go to a football game because prices are sky high, a large majority of those are from an ethnic minority background. And this is the point I raised to you beforehand as well. If you had more people in the stands from a background like that, would that, as a football fan, make you think twice about hurling those kinds of insults if the person on your right or your left is from the same background as your intended target on the football pitch?
Or does that actually potentially make the problem worse, and that there are more people there to abuse and to say those things too?
I always inherently think if the person's right next to you, you would think twice.
But the problem a lot of these football fans have is that for various reasons, whatever reason you want to think it would be, because there's the psychological theory of de-individuation about how you lose your self-awareness when you're in that group and you're in a pack mentality, or the copious amounts of alcohol a lot of these problem football fans drink in the lead up to football games and during football games, is that potentially they don't have any self-awareness, and if someone was standing right next to them, they wouldn't think twice because they're not thinking, because their brains are slightly fuzzed.
Then on that note, I'm on my wrong page.
Am I screwing your notes up?
The quote-unquote banter side of things, the alcohol bit kind of brings that point across, and that how many people think, maybe a bit like the guy you referenced, think it's okay to say things like that because it's banter and it's a joke. Because how often have we heard the word banter used as an excuse for just saying something downright abusive because it's in the name of fun?
Maybe in the 80s you could have got away with that excuse, but nowadays everyone knows what the line is in terms. Especially
does everyone abide by the line?
But everyone knows where the line should be, so you can't come out and make. I think who was the name of the comedian? Is it Danny Baker? Who, when
yes.
Prince Harry and Meghan
Baker.
had their child, put out that post on social media. That is, not to reference monkeys when it comes to people of colour, because that is a reference to racism that we've long since established. And to be making like monkey noises and things like that, if anyone's just to turn around and say that's banter and that's a joke, everyone knows in this country, everyone should know where the line is.
But presumably he put that out because he thought it was going to be banter, and that he great laughs and retweets.
It's just an idiot. Everyone should know where that line is, and if they don't, then I think there's a lot more educational work that needs to be done, because things like that are a complete no-no, and there really shouldn't be a line of what isn't banter when it comes to things like that. I don't know. It's just, I think
the reason I bring in
it's not banter. To racially abuse someone is not banter in any way.
Again, but we're seeing this from our point of view, in that I like to think we know where banter begins and where it doesn't begin. I hate that word. But then, how often have we talked about sexism on this podcast? And you get the comments on social media, get back in the kitchen, all that sort of stuff. You could put that in the same category, essentially, as racism. It's similarly abusive, yet everyone quotes it and attributes it as, it's alright, it's banter, every time they get name-checked on it.
But for me personally, I get as infuriated by that as I do by racist quotes.
Is it the same thought mentality?
There is a line as well with sexism and jokes about women being in the kitchen and all of that. They're so old, they're so outdated, they're not funny, and they are downright abusive. And it's the same with jokes about race, because there are no jokes really.
I put them in the same category, in that it's predominantly, I think, the same type of people that say those things as well. Because I don't want to say ill-educated, because everyone should know it, but that
is my argument. Everyone should know where the line is. I don't know why people are trying to push it.
Exactly, but they are just idiots who I think maybe very deep down believe these things and are just looking for a reaction from the people who disagree with them, but also some retweets if it's on social media, and some laughing and appreciation from their mates who think, oh my god, aren't you hilarious with this absolute banter joke. So on that note, I'll kind of move on to the next bit. The punishments that are out there at the moment, whether it's banning someone for a couple of years or banning them for 3 years. And I know we've talked about punishments a lot, in particular after the Bulgaria incident last week. Are they harsh enough? Do they need to be harsh enough? Or do you risk punishing every single person who might be innocent as well for the actions of the minority?
From my perspective, looking at the Bulgaria case, while yes, the majority of the Bulgarian fans in that stadium were probably well behaved and in no way condoning of that behaviour, it's not just the individuals who did it so they're at fault, but it is an issue with the Bulgarian FA as well, in that so many people were allowed to showcase that behaviour. When we do have examples of racist behaviour over here in this country, it is nowadays more and large one or two people. Like the Yeovil incident was supposedly one or two people. The Raheem Sterling was one or two people. But there's such an issue with fans in those countries that we spoke about previously, that the entire footballing fraternity, their entire FA, needs to be treated much harsher than they are. They need to be held accountable for this. I looked as a cricket fan, obviously, with South Africa and its apartheid regime. They were banned from cricket for 30 years, and I know this is something you've studied and are more qualified to talk about, but punishments like that, banning a country from participating until it can get its house in order and can prove its house is in order, I think has to be the way forward.
As you thankfully alluded to, thank you for that link up. I did my dissertation on race in football fandom and rugby fandom in South Africa, from the start of apartheid right up until the 2011 FIFA World Cup, banning a cricket team. There was a lot of links in there because they banned the rugby team as well for similar reasons, because of the apartheid regime. And this is why I keep mentioning the integration side of things, because since apartheid has come to an end, and you mentioned it from the rugby standpoint as well, gradually the generations have moved on and gone on. We're getting players picked for the rugby team, which is historically the white man's sport, on merit, not because of the quota that they have. And from a fan's perspective, that's why I think the integration side of things is so important to stamping out ideology like that, because you'll get to understand these people and get to understand their points of views, and that will make you think twice about how much hurt comments like that could actually have. And it's the lack of integration in South Africa that I criticised in my dissertation, because football fandom is still predominantly black, and rugby fandom is still predominantly white. Because football fandom is, again, so tribal, as in literally tribes in South Africa always have their different teams. They come from different parts of the cities that they represent. Yet, interestingly, the one football team in the Premier League in South Africa, which has a white fan base, Bidvest Wits, if anyone's interested, play at a university. That's where their home ground is. They've got a secure car park, security, and a lot of that fan base comes from the university, predominantly white people. This is also a point I tried to make when I did my County Lines drug crime investigation for Essex Live a few months ago. And again, comes back to the point with the council estates and people from poor backgrounds being predominantly from minority ethnic backgrounds. And a lot of them felt they had to get pressured into going one way, i.e. down a drug route, because that's what they were seeing, that's what the people around them were doing to make their money. Whereas if you actually got them early on and integrated them with people from all sorts of backgrounds and different societies, that can have a great effect long term in terms of getting them out of that sort of environment and getting to know people from other backgrounds, which is what David Simmons, who will soon be writing for our website, by the way, does with his project in Harlow, Changing Lives in Harlow. No matter what background, gets the disadvantaged kids to mix together, play sport together, and that has a great benefit for them going forwards. Which is why I think the integration point for fandom is so important in stamping it out.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's just a case of, I guess from where I grew up, the school I went to, there was a lot of integration between people from completely different cultures and different races and different backgrounds. And yet, I'm sure a lot of similar people to me in similar situations of my age, I'm talking about specifically, who grew up surrounded by so many different people, they go to these football matches and then they're still often the ones who are being racist. It's just, there is the integration there, but for some reason it's football more than any other sport. It still elicits this horrible language and taunts and insults, and it's just why is it only an issue in when it comes to sport, why is it so much of an issue in football when you don't get it so much in other sports? Obviously, there are one or two incidents, isolated incidents, both on and off the field, but football, as we've already discussed, is so much more of a regularity, and it's just difficult to comprehend exactly why.
I think a large part we can put down to some of the things we've already said, i.e. the tribalism, the normalisation of abuse, drunken behaviour, banter, all that sort of stuff. You add it all together, there's probably different reasons for each different case as well. Kind of add that all together.
With rugby, I mean, rugby fans on public transport to and from games are an issue because they're very loud, and quite a lot of them are rugby players themselves, so they're very big and strong and tall. But when they have the same issue, they all get up at 10 o'clock, the game's at 3, they'll be drinking all morning, but you don't get the same level of abuse, you don't get the same level of aggression. Quite often when they're in the stadium, they're having a laugh, having a joke around, singing songs. Why is it only in football? And cricket's the same as well, to be honest. People were drinking all day at the cricket, and I was at the Ashes this year. People have been drinking all day, and by the end of the day, the Aussies were getting some stick, but it was more in like good-humoured stick, like singing songs. It wasn't outright abuse. It wasn't being mean. It was sort of things like when, for example, Nathan Lyon catching a ball, given that his infamous drop of the run out in the third test that England came back and won. He was every time he caught the ball, everyone was cheering and clapping him sarcastically, and it's things like that. And it was done in good humour, and he took it well, and it wasn't out abusing him as a man or anything like that. It was just a play on an incident that happened recently that we'll forget in 2 or 3 years. So why is it in football where everyone seems to go not that little bit, just everyone goes too far and it's too aggressive, and the abuse is so much more?
Because it's just so normalised. It's like the good-humoured abuse versus the vitriol abuse that we so often see. I suppose to wrap this off, because if people hadn't really found out or worked it out by themselves, we're quite invested in this topic. I suppose we've done various bits of studies into it in our own time back when we were young, naive students. Can we draw any conclusions as to how we can actually help the situation or make the situation any better so that we don't have incident after incident, week after week?
When it comes to issues that teams are facing in the likes of Bulgaria, Serbia, Italy, punishments need to be harsher, and not just on individuals but on the footballing FA. As for our own country, it's difficult to say really, to know exactly where to go right, because there's always the worry that doing something that you think could help actually could make it worse. Your example of trying to get more fans from different backgrounds and different races and ethnicities into football, you think it could help, I think it could have the opposite effect. So it's a case of, it's really difficult to know what is right, but we all know that we need to get our own house in order over here in this country as well, because I think my earlier point, maybe I glossed over the fact that there are still a lot of racial problems in this country, but overall we're in a much better position and a much more tolerant position than other cultures, but we as a culture still have a lot of work we need to do. And I think perhaps it's a cultural change that we have to make that will hopefully then transfer into football and other sporting arenas.
Yeah, to avoid the inevitability of going on for like an hour on this topic, the harsher punishment side of things, the education side of things, that all kind of speaks for itself. But I do think we need to take more of a societal view at it, and at the moment we're taking too much of a football-only view at it. We're sitting here in a time where we're probably at our most divided as a country, what with referendums and all that you may have seen on the news. But even then, it doesn't go just to Brexit. You could flip that over to Scottish independence, for example, and really as a society and as a culture, I don't think I recall seeing a more divided country at this point. So I like to think that a large part of the solution lies in solving those divisions at a societal level and a deep-rooted level as well, which is a lot easier said than done when you see some of the things that people say about each other and that get bandied around in all corners, whether it's on social media or via protests, in debates, things like that. So on that depressing note, we'll bring that topic.
We've got more heartwarming topics to come.
Yes, we'll bring that topic to an end, and we'll talk about something a little bit more uplifting after this.
You're listening to SportSpiel, the Players Podcast.
Thursday, October 10th was World Mental Health Day, an international day to raise awareness about an issue that still plagues so many people and still isn't fully understood. Mental health is a very big thing on this podcast. It's important to us as hosts, and it's also important to a lot of our guests. I think Laura Gallagher, Ruth Fox, Shona McCallan, they're just three who've all spoken about their mental health on this podcast. Sport also has an important part to play. In many ways, it's an amazing escapism, but in others, the pressure and intensity can be a big challenge to deal with. So in this part of the show, we'll be reflecting on some of the recent stories that have come out from athletes who have chosen to open up and talk, and we'll bring some wider points in later as well. But we'll begin with Suzy Petty, who you work with closely, and she bravely revealed on that day that she'd been battling an eating disorder for 10 years. So I'll just pass it on to you because I know it's something that you were very invested in.
She didn't actually reveal it on the day. It was about a week afterwards, but she said she tried to sort of start writing the post on the day, but it took her a long time to formulate and to talk about it. And having known Suzy for slightly longer than the time I've been at England Hockey, because I'd interviewed her before, and having got to know her as a colleague, you know, she's by far and away one of the fittest, strongest, leanest athletes we've got, and she is an absolute machine in the gym and on the pitch as well. I don't know if I've ever seen her appear fatigued, even at the end of a ridiculously hot day playing hockey, because she is like I said, she's a machine. So to see her come out and write such a post and to have been suffering with such issues for such a long time, for me was a surprise and a shock to see, but also the way I thought she messaged it was really empowering and really inspirational, and I sent a message to her to say that as well. I'm sure she got plenty. I know she got plenty of great messages as well, and it seems to be that days like this now and weeks like we have, like Mental Health Awareness Week earlier in the year as well, are now where athletes are being able to come out and open up and share their experiences of their mental health issues. I know fellow colleague Harry Gibson as well, a bloke I get on with really, really well, and I have a lot of time and respect for. He's been very open in the last few months about his struggles with mental health. Maddie Hinch, potentially our most famous player at the time of a recording, she's been quite open recently about the struggle she had post Rio and why she needed to take a break from the international game. And then one video that I saw as well was one the ECB did with Kate Cross. So Kate Cross alongside Sarah Taylor have both been brilliant in the way they have approached talking about their struggles with anxiety and other mental health problems in sport. They've been, again, really empowering and really inspirational with it. And the 5-minute video the ECB produced this week with Kate was really outlining her experiences and those who've helped get her through it. And the messages she was sharing was fantastic. And it's brilliant to see that these athletes now feel comfortable to open up and talk about mental health. And it's fantastic that sports is a way that they sort of can get through it. But at the same time, it also raises the question of a lot of these people have been put in this situation because of professional sport as well, and it does raise the question of, is enough being done preventatively with athletes to stop them from getting into these situations?
That is ultimately the big question. Likewise, I agree. It's good to see so many people feeling they can talk openly about it in a comfortable environment now. I think gradually the stigma behind mental health and suffering from mental health is going away, the more awareness there is. Emma Mitchell was another story that I picked up on around the time of World Mental Health Day as well. Of course, she plays for Arsenal, and she said in her interview on the BBC that she spent 15 minutes crying in the shower when Arsenal was celebrating winning their WSL title, which should have been a moment for everyone around to to join in and celebrate because it had been so many years since that club won the title. Yet here she was, and thinking that she would be a burden on her teammates if she said anything to them about the way she was feeling. She did talk to her manager, Joe Montemurro, about it, and I think she, in the end, didn't play between February and April. But even so, it shows the pressure that sport can put on you. Laura Gallagher, I think, is a prime example that we can both allude to, considering she mentioned it on this show, about how much of a pressure that can have on you as well. And while I've got it noted down as well, I'll mention Katie Startup, Charlton goalkeeper, who is wearing the number 40 this season to raise awareness about suicide, because one person around the world dies every 40 seconds through suicide. So again, moves like that, great in pushing that forward. I suppose then we touch on the bigger question: why are there not more checks in place? Why is there not more help available? It helps for a club like Arsenal at the WSL that Emma Mitchell had a psychologist to turn to, but that's not always the case in certain sports, and perhaps those sorts of facilities should be made more readily available to athletes when they do face these tough times. We look at Elise Christie, for example, as someone who's posted a lot about the struggles she's been going through lately, and it just seems to be a recurring theme that only now we're actually properly looking into.
I think one of the things that makes mental health such a difficulty to deal with is that everyone reacts differently to different treatments and to different approaches. And this is something Remy, when she first talked to us, Remy Allen, spoke about really well, and she said she struggled with 2 or 3 therapists and psychologists that she was initially made aware of and put in contact with, because they didn't work with methods that work for her. And whereas I know people always looking for different opinions from doctors and surgeons and things like that, but largely you're only going to need 1 or 2 doctors, 1 or 2 physios to sort of find a solution to help you through a physical injury. But with mental health, it being such a broad spectrum and it affects everybody differently. An ACL injury could be exactly the same for 2 different people. A broken leg could be exactly the same for 2 different people, but 2 different people might suffer from depression in completely different ways and need completely different methods of understanding which. And having the facilities to effectively have almost a psychologist for everyone is impossible, even in football, where there is a lot of money. And I know that the psychologists we have at Great Britain and England Hockey do amazing work, and they are both fantastic, and the work they've done with the teams is great. But I know Suzy has to see a specialist psychiatrist to help her through her problem as well. And I don't know if that comes through the EIS or if that's private or independent or anything like that. But the fact is that it's so difficult to cater for every single different possible eventuality that it's always going to be difficult for clubs to manage it, and a lot of the onus will fall on the players themselves to find someone that works for them outside of professional sport.
Is the pressure too much in professional sport? Picking up 2, maybe 3 examples. Marvin Sordell, former footballer, has talked a lot about the pressures that being a footballer had on him, and the mental application, the determination, the fact that you need to dedicate yourself entirely to that sport can essentially have a detrimental effect on the rest of your life. Because if football's not going well, then what? Lizzie Simmons, who was on this podcast talking about identity, and she said it was still quite a damaging thing to, as an athlete, dedicate yourself completely to your sport without having something else to focus on, or another pathway, if you like, another identity, as she put it. Because, again, if it's not going well, then what? But there still seems to be a stigma among the athlete world that if you don't dedicate yourself 100%, 110% to your sport, then that's a second off the clock if you're running that you could have gained if you had put in that extra 10%, or an extra bit of fitness that you could have had if you had put in that 10%. So it's striking that right balance, really. And I think there's still maybe a lot of attitudes that need to be changed in that regard, that you don't need, as much as we like to say it's great to be able to put in that much effort into your sport, and I know pundits across the board often praise people for putting in that much effort, but later down the line, deeper, if we actually dig deeper, does that have a real damaging effect on them as people?
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of quite similar cases that seem to be forming a pattern at the moment of people who give their all to get to the elite level, and then the initial stages of the elite level, and then they get to them sort of early mid 20s, and then they start to really, really suffer. Laura Gallagher being one, Lizzie Simmons being another. And of course, again, not every athlete's going to be like that. So, for example, Suzy is in her mid 20s, but she has said this is a battle she's had for 10 years with her eating and things like that. And then we have other instances of people who start suffering sort of in their teenage years. But I think there is such pressure put on to make that elite level at such a young age that people are not really encouraged to look after themselves mentally. People are encouraged to look after themselves physically, and people are encouraged to look after themselves nutritionally. But are people encouraged to look after themselves mentally, to take time away? And it's the same, you could say, with exams and things like that as well. I know a lot of people who weren't allowed to play sport because of exams, and for those people, sport wasn't the be all and end all, but it was an escape for them. But for other people, people aren't going to be allowed to take a weekend off training, things like that, because they may be feeling a little down in inverted speech marks. Coaches need to be taught to spot the signs of mental pressure and to help athletes deal with mental pressure as well as the pressure of physically as well. And a lot, by the looks of it, does need to be changed with coaches earlier on in life, because I think when you get to the top, a lot of the elite coaches now are actually much more aware of that and are much better at looking after that. And I know, for example, the coaches, the way they interact with our psychologists at England Great Britain Hockey is fantastic, and the work they do around that is fantastic, and the players do really get looked after, but it's actually getting them to that stage that seems to be the problem.
I suppose then the important takeaway from this is to have an escape, to have something to take your mind away. If your life is sport, that's your profession, it's healthy to have something out of sport that can distract you for a bit. Doing the jobs that we do, talking from my personal experience, sport is my escapism, whether it's fencing, running, or watching it. That's how I detract from my professional life. So that's one way we can bring in the powerful impacts of sport and how it can help with your mental well-being. But to put it in one catch-all term, I think it's having the escapism that's probably the most important thing. Yeah,
and it's something I struggled with when I was younger, because cricket was one of my biggest triggers for my anxiety. And it still does get me, even now, I don't take it anywhere near as seriously as I used to, but I still get really nervous. And I don't really know what my escapism is, because everything for me is sport. But I used to do a lot of music as well, but that used to also get me quite wound up, because there was things like having to practice for exams and performances. I think at uni, the jazz group I was in was a massive escape for me. When everything was getting difficult, just being able to go along and just play jazz for 2 hours a week was brilliant. And at the same time, cheer initially provided me with that comfort, although later on it became more of a stressor for various reasons. But I think the key is people should be encouraged to have an escapism where they can just take themselves out of that zone. And I was actually speaking to one of our athletes, Chris Griffiths, for a little mini documentary we were putting together at work, and I spoke with him and his girlfriend, and they talk about how one of the best things about being elite athletes but in different sports is that they know that when they're outside of training and outside of competition environment, they both understand each other, and they both understand that they need that escapism, and they can provide that with each other. So they go dog walking, paddleboarding, they do things together as a couple, and they just ignore the fact that they're elite athletes. They're just a couple, and that's their way of escaping. But they've had to find that the hard way through the difficult times. And that's something that should be being taught to athletes at a very early age, that they should have that escape, that other thing that they can just relax in, and that needs to be part of their timetable regularly and should never be something that sort of gets chalked off in terms of fitting in another session. That should be as regular as having food, really, for them. That should be as set in stone, is that escapism, and that's something that needs to start being taught to younger athletes.
Wholeheartedly agree. And I suppose what we can also both agree on is that the more people talk, the more people that share their stories, the more it becomes normalised, and the more people feel it's okay to actually open up and seek help when they're in that phase where they are struggling. We'll move on to our final topic. Again, more light-hearted after this quick break. Make sure you follow SportSpiel on social media. Search for SportSpiel Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or on LinkedIn. In this part of today's show, we celebrate the multi-talented, highly skilled athletes who enjoyed success in not one, but more than one different sports. That is after former Chelsea and Arsenal goalkeeper Petr Cech signed for the Guildford Flames ice hockey side. They play in Britain's 4th tier. On his debut as a goaltender, he saved 2 penalties in a shootout win and was named man of the match. Not a bad debut at all. So, what other athletes have we got who stepped up in more than one sport? Well, we have quite a few to share. As predicted, since we planned this separately, we've come together today and found out that we both got quite a few similar names. Planning for you. So I suppose the best way to do it is just to go back and forth with 2 or 3 each.
Whoa,
examples.
I mean, it's difficult
because we have quite a
to
few.
narrow it down. The first athlete I thought of was Dame Sarah Storey, multiple Paralympic champion at both swimming and cycling, and a mum as well.
That's multitasking to the max.
She's just brilliant. And then also on that similar theme, Kadina Cox as well, who has excelled at 2 different sports at the same Paralympic Games as well. I think she was the first person to win gold medals in 2 different disciplines since the 1980s. So they were 2 that immediately sprung to mind.
I'll kick off with my football ones. Thank you for the pun. Lev Yashin. World famous Soviet Union goalkeeper. He was considered one of the greatest goalkeepers of all time. He was also the poster for the Russian World Cup in 2018. One of the greatest in history, but he also played bandy and ice hockey internationally for the Soviet Union. Unsurprisingly, he was a goalkeeper in all 3 of those sports. Bandy, for anyone who doesn't know, is kind of like ice hockey, and then it's played on ice, except it uses sticks and a ball, and it's more of a football pitch-sized arena with 11 players on each side. Fun bandy knowledge there. Apparently you knew bandy anyway.
Yeah, that some A-level PE knowledge there.
Go on A-level PE. My final footballer, I'll mention Ivan Perisic, Croatian, was of course runner-up in the last World Cup, currently playing for Bayern Munich, and he also represented Croatia in volleyball. Who knew?
Wikipedia knew. That is who.
I'll say that's our source for most of these.
There's quite a lot of women that we found that have excelled at a number of different sports. Again, I've already mentioned 2. Another one that came to mind quite early on is Elise Perry, one of the greatest cricketers in the world at the moment in time. Scores runs for fun, takes wickets for fun. And she has also been a Matilda star as well, having represented her country on quite a few occasions in association football, as it's known over there, as well as being a superb cricketer. So there's another inspiring female. Another one, Australian, was on the same theme, Ash Barty as well, the 2019 French Open winner. Actually took time out of tennis back in 2015 to play in the Women's Big Bash League alongside Perry, or actually opposite Perry. And going on to more home turf, Rebecca Romero. who won a rowing silver in the quadruple sculls at Athens in 2004 before winning the individual pursuit in Beijing in 2008. The women's individual pursuit was then scrapped for London 2012, so she turned her hand to Ironman triathlons instead and excelled at those.
Pretty good. Continuing on the female athlete theme, Katie Taylor of boxing. You were surprised to know this because you didn't know this. Played 11 times for the Republic of Ireland women's football team as well.
I feel like I should have known that.
Again, pretty good standard. Clara Hughes, Canadian cyclist who won 2 bronze medals in road cycling at the 1996 Olympics, then went on to represent Canada in speed skating and won bronze at the 2002 Winter Olympics, a gold and a silver in the 2006 Olympics, and a bronze in 2010. Highly successful in multiple disciplines there. Final one, Melissa Rusco of New Zealand, served as captain of both the New Zealand football team. She then switched to rugby union more specifically, and became captain of the New Zealand rugby team there, and also won the Rugby World Cup in 2006 and 2010.
Sticking on the rugby theme, Sonny Bill Williams as well, part of the New Zealand All Blacks team that decimated Ireland in the Rugby World Cup quarter-final yesterday as we record. He's won 2 World Cups, I think. I think he's been part of both the 2011 and 2015 winning squads. He's also represented New Zealand in Rugby League and boxed professionally 6 times and held the WBA International Heavyweight Champion belt. From a country not too far from New Zealand, from Tonga. Obviously, it is the infamous shirtless Tongan. Apologies if this pronunciation is correct. Peter
Try again.
Peter Taufatafua.
Good effort.
Who shot to prominence at Rio with his fantastic physique when he was flag bearing for Tonga. He represented them in Taekwondo at that Olympics. He then represented them in 2018 at cross-country skiing and is hoping to represent his country as well in another sport in Tokyo.
Will he keep his shirt on this time round?
Well, on both occasions, they were when he was flag bearing.
He was bearing all.
He was bearing all. And did you know he is the first person to ever be a country's flag bearer at both the Summer and Winter Olympic Games?
Multiple records to his name.
For you. And Pyeongchang 2018 was also infamous for the pursuits of Esther Ledecka, who stunned the world in the snowboarding when she won a title when no one really expected her to do anything, and then she went on and won a skiing title as well. And I think she's the first woman to ever achieve gold medals in both disciplines at the same Winter Olympic Games, so that's quite an achievement. And my final one, going back to British terms, and someone who we're hopefully going to get on the show very soon, is Laura Sugar. She captained Wales, I believe. She definitely played up to under 21 level in the sport of hockey. Was then told she could have a career as a para-athlete with, I think she has a club foot. So she's won European titles and represented GB at Paralympic Games on the track. And she's now transitioned over to para-canoeing, where she has won world and European titles and medals. And hopefully will be representing GB at both sports in Tokyo 2020. So we are, as she is a Mintridge athlete, we are hoping to have her on the show soon to speak more.
Hashtag Team Mintridge. I will finish with 3 sporting giants. First one, Surrey and Botham. I don't think this is a surprise to many people. Obviously one of the most famous, most gifted all-rounders for England cricket. Also played football for Scunthorpe United and Yeovil Town. So Chris Hoy, obviously one of our most famous Olympics champion cyclists, and he entered motorsport after his retirement and ended up racing in the Le Mans 24 Hours in 2016. Final one, Fred Perry. Of the tennis, of the clothing brand, I have Fred Perry shoes on right now, you may have noticed. Of course, highly successful tennis player. He won 8 Grand Slams, including 3 consecutive Wimbledon championships from 1934 to 1936, and was the last British man to win Wimbledon before Andy Murray came along. But he was also world table tennis champion in 1929. How about that?
Don't all these people make you sick about how good at sport they are?
Just a little bit.
Sick with jealousy.
And on that rather scary note. That brings an end to that part of the show. We've got some final messages after this. Right, that is almost it for this particular discussion episode. We will be back with our next episode in 1 week's time. That's October the 27th. Who is our guest / guests?
2 guests. We are entering new territory next week as we take on women's basketball for the first time, and we are lucky to be joined by the head coach of the Great Britain and England women's basketball teams, Chema Busetta, and the Chief Executive of England Basketball, Stuart Kellett. It's quite a wide-ranging interview. We talk about the success of the international teams and how they are trying to overhaul the face of basketball and get more women and girls active in the sport. Chema is one interesting individual to listen to, and I assure you, you do not want to miss it because he's just bonkers. He's brilliant.
I haven't listened to it yet, and you've intrigued me even more.
He just loves talking, and he's really funny.
That's the kind of guests we love. In terms of other items or any other business on this, you may have seen I put a little request out on Twitter. If anyone or any sports journalists who may be listening to this, or any up-and-coming sports journalists
Or athletes
who want to come on and occasionally guest present with us, DM me or send us an email to sportspielpod@gmail.com letting us know your interest. We have a big pool now of people who will be rotating guests on this podcast, so you'll get to know each and every one of them, I'm sure, very, very soon. Some of them you may have already heard from already. Other than that, the usual messages apply. Do follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Our handles are all SportSpielPod. And do get in touch with us if there's anything on your mind or you want to find out about certain things. SportSpielPod@gmail.com, I've already said, is our email address. Superpod 2020. I'm very organised for this one. It's in March in 2020, raising funds for sport relief. We're going to be there. We're part of the lineup. So do check that out. I'm sure some more acts will be announced as time goes on, but since we're a sports podcast and it's for sport relief, very good cause to get behind. Final message from me. I'm doing a half marathon, also in March, for the Mintridge Foundation. I've signed up to the Vitality Half in London, 1st of March. I'll set up a profile and a funding page very soon. Please donate to that, anyone. I'm looking at you as well. Once that's set up, please do. Other than that, got anything exciting this week?
I guess for us, it's just the build up to the Olympic qualifiers now at England and Great Britain hockey. It's I don't know, I'm quite looking forward to November the 4th, to be honest, when it's all done and the teams have qualified, because I have no doubts. I have complete faith that they will qualify. It's just a case of getting it out of the way now. So make sure you're watching on TV. Not quite sure if it's BT Sport or BBC yet, so keep your ears peeled for that one. Not your eyes, but your ears. And if you want to get down to Lee Valley Hockey and Tennis Centre on the 2nd or 3rd of November and see 2 fantastic games of hockey, do it. It's, you have a chance to be part of history. Join the prize and help our athletes on the road to Tokyo.
It's almost like I've read that in a tweet somewhere. Who could have written that tweet?
Me!
There we go. I cannot offer you the same sort of sporting excitement to come along to because I'm in local news. So I'll be editing, writing some more court stories for everyone in Essex world. With that, thank you so much for joining us on this particular episode, listeners. We will be back with more interviews as always next week. We will see you very soon.